Hello, it's Jabra again with more Old Testament, with more Book of Genesis, with the segment in the Book of Genesis that the Jews term Chayei Sarah, which means the life of Sarah. And this week we'll be covering chapters 24 to 28, which start with Abraham tying loose ends in Isaac's life by getting him married. Abraham also gets married again. We'll talk about that briefly. Then the story of his two sons, Jacob and Esau, and Rebecca's role in things. So this will be it. This is where we've been. Abraham now, as we studied last week, has passed his final test and he's tying some loose ends. And to make sure that the promises get fulfilled in Isaac, he needs to get him married. So he gets the head of his household, Eliezer of Damascus, and this is not going to be the last role that Eliezer will play in this story. And he gets him in and he asks him to swear an oath to him to find first to find a wife, second that this wife is not a Canaanite, because Abraham, there can be many reasons for that. Now we know that Abraham has adopted Jehovah Elohim as the God of his household. He is the God of the family. He's made covenants. And we know also from the Pearl of Great Price that he has been given certain promises, and he wants to make sure, and he knows that God is a jealous God, that he doesn't want other gods to be worshipped, and so he doesn't want his family to be ensnared in all the Canaanite worship. So he directs his servant, the head of his household, the man who manages everything that Abraham has. He directs him to go to the country of his birth. Now, I want you to notice verse 4, Abraham's command, to my country, to where I was born, go. So that's where Eliezer is go. Nothing else in this verse. So keep that in mind. Put it in a side note and keep it there. Now, in verse 5, Eliezer is concerned and he says, well, what if I go there and the woman I find, isn't willing to come back with me? Now, remember, he is going to go to Mesopotamia, where Abraham came from. And Mesopotamia is a lush, rich place, the birthplace of civilizations. It's like going to New York or going to somewhere very civilized. And Eliezer is rightly concerned that a woman living in such a place would not want to come back to Canaan, where probably news has arrived, or they've received news about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the War of Five Kings, Lot being imprisoned, taken prisoner, and all of this turmoil. Who would want to leave that place, to leave Mesopotamia, lush Mesopotamia, rich Mesopotamia, cultured Mesopotamia, and go to Canaan? A desert, which is not very barren, but still a desert, hard living, lots of political turmoil. So Abraham promises him, tells him two things. He says, the Lord has promised me that this country, meaning Canaan, where he is going to be mine, is given me. And because I have a promise of the Lord, the Lord will send an angel with you to guide your steps and make sure that you have a successful mission. So there is an act of faith here, and Abraham has faith that the Lord will take care of things, and he is appealing to Eliezer's faith also. So then there is this, and he says, Abraham basically says, if the woman refuses, then you have no obligation to me. You're free from the oath you've made to me. But as a sign of the oath, he asks him to put his hands on his thigh. Now, this is usually a very sort of semi-minor controversy in the scriptures. It has been interpreted in many ways, from the sexually explicit to, the culturally innocent. But to this day in the Middle East, especially in Arabic, we have an expression, Idi bizunarak, which literally translated means put your hand on my belt, or in my belt. And that is basically indicative of, I'm with you, I promise you I'm going to do something. This is similar. Now, the origin of this sign of an oath, I have no idea where it came from. I can speculate, but I will not do that here. So the oath and the sign are exchanged, and Eliezer leaves to Mesopotamia, to Aram, between the rivers. And after he arrives to Nahor's village, Nahor being Abraham's brother, he rests his camels, and he arrives at a certain time in the evening. Basically the time when the women are going out to get water for the household, the evening run for water, to cook, to wash, and do all kinds of things in the household. So Eliezer does something very interesting here. So in Middle Eastern, Near Eastern culture in general, there is this divination. Whether I need to know what to do. In ancient Arabia, they would have a bunch of arrows. They'd throw them to the ground, and based on the direction that the arrows point to, they would travel. Or they would look at a bunch of birds laying down. They would scare them and see if the birds would fly to the right or to the left, and see if the birds fly left, then we're not going to go on a trip. If the birds fly right, we will go on a trip. And in a similar manner, here Eliezer performs something akin to divination, but it's not. And the Jewish rabbis have made this point plainly clear, that this is in their commentaries, that this is not divination, because Eliezer prays to God, he says, Father of my Lord Abraham. And he asks for a blessing, and then he says, here is the sign, and he devises a very interesting sign. He says, I'll stand by the water, I'll watch the women of the village coming out to get water, and then whatever maiden I will call and say, water my animals, water my camels. Now, Eliezer went out, by the way, with 10 camels and everything that his lord Abraham had. And this is a sign of wealth. This is something to show the family of the bride to be that she is going to be a part of a large inheritance, a large domain. It's a show of power to woo the bride. Actually, the story is usually called in commentaries the wooing of Rebecca. So, and camels at that time, if the historians are right, weren't a very common thing in the Near East, especially in Mesopotamia. Camels were not widely used, and they were sort of an exotic animal, and possessing them was a sign of great power and wealth. Now, before he finishes the prayer, it says he sees this very beautiful woman coming out, and her name is Rebecca. And Rebecca means to bind, as if in a snare almost. So you bind, and you bind someone tightly. And it's usually used in etymological dictionaries. They say it's used in ancient Hebrew culture to mean someone who like snares men with her beauty. So a very fitting name for Rebecca, and how the story will go. Rebecca comes out. She's carrying her jar. She's carrying pottery. Now, pottery makes a showing here, and pottery is a sign of Mesopotamian civilization. It was invented there. Pottery will play a big, a minor part in the story of Jacob and Esau. I'll explain it when I come to it, but will sort of make the story make more sense. So, of course, they list here in verse 16 the qualifications that they were looking for. She's good looking, she's a virgin, has known no man, and she did her duty. She filled the jar with water, and she left. So Eliezer goes to her and asks her to, as in his prayer, he asks her to water his camels, and she does not hesitate. So notice Rebecca's story is starting to mirror the story of Abraham, and I will talk about this in a few minutes. She is someone who, when commanded, she just sort of says, I will do it. She goes and does right away. She immediately goes, she takes off her jar, and she watered the camels until all the camels drank and they didn't want water anymore. Now, 10 camels, filling water for them, that is tremendous strength. All Eliezer is doing is he's holding the camels still while she's going to bring the water and have the camels drink. So she is the perfect woman. And what Eliezer does next is he takes this earrings, bracelets, nose rings, and he gives them to her. In the culture, this is sort of a dowry. This is a sign that I want you to be married to someone related to me. This is the sign, and it is designed to, again, wowing. This is, some people estimate that the amount of gold given here was income for 4 years for people working in that era. So he's given her income for 4 years, a lot of money. And of course, he learns that she is actually the daughter of Betuel, and that she's from the family of Abraham, and Eliezer is very grateful for that. So he thanks the Lord, goes to, in verse 29, goes to the house of Rebecca, goes back home. Her brother Laban sees her, sees all the gold she's wearing, and he realizes what's happening. And this is the beginning of noticing in the story, because Laban will make an appearance again with Jacob, Rebecca's son. And we can tell something about his inclinations, because he looks and he sees the gold, and he immediately goes and talks to Eliezer. And Eliezer goes to their house to stay with them. Now hospitality is extended, and then Eliezer invokes a custom that is in the Middle East to this day. In most Middle Eastern Bedouin cultures, when you go to someone's house and you want to ask for something, usually they will serve you tea, coffee, food, nuts, whatever the hospitality is in the country. And if you have something to ask or something to say, you push it away and you say, I'm not going to touch this until I say what I came here to say. And usually this is done in engagement ceremonies, and they serve coffee. People going to propose, they refuse the coffee, and then they propose, and if the proposal is accepted, then they drink the coffee, and the deal is done. So what Eliezer does is he retells the whole story, but there are changes that he makes, where he, remember in verse 4, Abraham says, you go to the country, to my country, to the place where I was born. That's it. And find a bride for my son. But here, Eliezer, in verses 37, 40, 41, and 47 adds a little bit to Abraham's words. Maybe he's doing a bit of an interpretation of his own. It's not lying, it's not telling an untruth, but he's adding an interpretation for a purpose, and he adds the word kindred. He says, my Lord told me, go to the country, go to take a wife for my son from my kindred, from the house of my father. So why is Eliezer doing this? Eliezer is doing this because, again, to this day, definitely in Islamic cultures, there is a priority to a paternal cousin in marriage. So this is your cousin on your father's side. So if you're a male, your cousin on your father's side, your female cousin on your father's side, you have a priority to be married to her. So if you like your cousin on your father's side, and she's, even if she's engaged to someone else, you have priority. And because Rebecca is so beautiful, I believe Eliezer wanted to invoke that right so that he guarantees that she is Isaac's. So he repeats this in the story several times to invoke that right of the paternal cousin. And Laban, what Laban does in verse 50, he doesn't say yes or no. He says, obviously, he's a believer in God, and he says, this has come from God. We have no say in it. She's yours. Now, the next thing that happens, Eliezer wants to leave, most likely after the 3 days of hospitality, and he wants to take Rebecca with him. He is a doer. He wants to finish the mission. And Laban, of course, this is again a pattern that we will see in Laban's story later on with Jacob. He wants to keep Rebecca for a while. Maybe based on what we will know later from the story of Jacob, maybe to get the servant to come back again, and then he will play his game of, I'm not going to let her go, but then the servant will give him more. But this doesn't work. What happens is Rebecca is called and she weighs in, and they say, do you want to leave now and go with this man? And Rebecca does it. Rebecca makes the decision. And this is interesting because, again, this story is kind of mirroring Abraham. Remember, Lech Lecha, Abraham is someone who left Ur of the Chaldeans, who left Aram between the rivers, who left Mesopotamia because the Lord said, leave and Lech Lecha, and Abraham was immediately Lech Lecha. He just left. And Rebecca is doing the same here. She's leaving her family, everything she knows, her life, her position, her kin, and she's going to the strange land, to a strange family that she doesn't know. And in verse 58, they ask her if she wanted to go with the man, and she said, yes, I will go. I will go. So she's mirroring Abraham. And this is sort of how the writer of this, how the writer of Genesis is basically saying she is a righteous person. She is fit to be in the house of Abraham because she's behaving like Abraham. And they leave. Now they arrive in Canaan. Isaac is wandering in the desert. There is sort of this imagery here. He's going out to pray at night. Jews to this day, their evening prayers are inspired by Isaac. This is how they determined that evening time is a time to pray. The Amida, the Shema, they pray at night because Isaac prayed at night, and they see him. And the interesting thing is, in different translations, this is portrayed as Rebecca gets off the camel. So she gets off the camel, but in and earlier translations, the Samaritan and the Gaon translation of the Torah, she falls off the camel. It's as if she saw him, she loved him, and she fell off the camel. And then she asks Eliezer, "Who is this?" And Eliezer says, "He is my Lord. He is." And so she covers her face. And face covering here is again a tradition. A man, he's still a stranger. They haven't been married, and so she has to cover her face. So the Eliezer tells Isaac everything that has happened, and Isaac takes her to his mother's to Sarah's tent. Now Sarah is the mother. He takes her to his mother's tent, and that is a sign that, well, Rebecca now is the sort of chief woman in the house. She's the second of the Ummahot, the mothers, the matriarchs of Judaism. And to emphasize the kind of relationship that Isaac and Rebecca have, it says here she became his wife, and he loved her, and she consoled him for his mother's loss. So this is where that story of Isaac and Rebecca starts. Now we're in this part of the book. We finished what scholars call the Abraham cycle, the portions that relate to Abraham. Now we're in the Isaac and Jacob cycle, and they are in one cycle, one segment of the scriptures of the book of Genesis. And so in part 25, in chapter 25, there is this genealogy of Abraham. Abraham, of course, lives to be 175. Notice again, he's a righteous, he's a Sadiq, he's a Hasid, he's a righteous person. He lives way beyond the 120 years that God decreed after the flood as the maximum age of man. So this is a sign of his righteousness. And he marries Keturah. Keturah means drops and drops of perfume. Probably an indication of where she came from. She came from the southern tribes, people who traded in spices and stuff like that. Probably this is what scholars argue. And she's the mother of Midian and Maiden and Shuh and all kinds of nations. Many of them will become enemies of Israel later on, but that's another story. Now, what Abraham does here, again, controversial. All of the sons from Keturah, the word is banishes them. He kicks them out of Canaan. He kicks them out of Canaan. But he gives them money. So to Ishmael, he gives the land and everything that he has, but he gives gifts to the other sons and banishes them out of Canaan. Unimaginable for a father to do, but Abraham wants to guarantee that Isaac is the sole possessor of the land, that there is no competition from his own family, that there are no disputes. And then he dies, and he's buried at Machpelah. He's buried at the what they call in literal translation the double tomb. And then there is a quick mention of Ishmael and his houses. And Ishmael lives 137 years, also an indication that he wasn't bad, he was righteous. He lived only 17 years above the 120 years of age that God has decreed for man. And that is the end of chapters 24 and almost all of chapter 25. We'll resume in the next segment. We will talk about the story of Rebecca and Jacob and Esau, and with all the richness that is therein. Thank you for listening.